Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Strength and Weakness podcast, the messy home from home edition, with Ellen and myself, Morgan, as your co-host. It's great to be back with you. I know that Ellen hosted our last one, so it was lovely to see you, Ellen, step into the role of hostess with the mostess. But we are excited to be back with you guys today. We will start, of course, with our messy moment, and then we'll dive into our topic for the day. I will keep you waiting. And while we do that, Ellen, why don't you kick us off with your messy moment?
Well, you and I both had some pretty messy moments over these past couple of weeks because we both of our households had the stomach flu, the dreaded norovirus. I didn't even know what norovirus was until my kids were puking it up, and then I was too. But I will tell you, so lots of messy moments that I don't even think, like, if people might be eating breakfast while they're listening to this, I don't want to go into too much detail on those messy moments. But I will say the irony in our home that was super messy is as we're dealing with norovirus, which is basically an exorcism of any liquid in your body coming out of both ends. That's how it felt for me, at least. On this day, the first day that we got, so my youngest had it for 2 days, then he got over it. Then the next day, the rest of us got it. On that day, our bidet broke. And I just thought, isn't this the ultimate irony? Is this God smiting us where he's like, not only am I going to do this exorcism of all the liquid starting from your toes all the way up through your body, but you also have no bidet that you've become so dependent on. So yeah, that was my messy moment.
Thank you for sharing. And I think anybody who's listening to this, who is a parent, and if you're not, this is a gift to you right now. But if you're a parent and you are sick and then your kids are also sick and your spouse is also sick, there is just a twistedness about it because you just want to curl up into a ball and just be so sick and have somebody take care of you. But the truth is you have little people who are depending on you and just want to snuggle or mommy, take care of me. And you're like, I just want to be alone and not touched at the moment,
Yeah.
And then you're like, spouse, can you help? And you're like, oh, you're also puking. Nice.
Yeah.
Okay. What? Help yourself, child. No, I'm just kidding.
It's the ultimate cruelty to be sick as a mom, truly, because there's no one that cares for you, but you have to care for everyone else. It's very difficult.
Oh, man. Well, hopefully whoever's listening to this got a kick out of it. Not funny at the time, but glad we can look back.
Yes. And norovirus is not contagious through radio waves, so we're all safe.
Boom. Boom, boom, boom. Alrighty, well, let's jump into our topic for today. We are going to be tackling a very interesting topic, that being how to deal with temptations when they arise when it comes to same-sex attraction. So if you're listening and you're a believer, you will come into contact with temptations of all sorts, right? We're human, we're flawed, we deal with temptations every day. So even if you're not same-sex attracted and you stumbled upon this podcast and you're like, I don't know if I can relate, I encourage you to listen because I think that you'll be able to walk away with maybe some tangible takeaways that will help you fight the temptations that you come up against. Because the truth is, same-sex attraction is just another temptation that people face. So we are going to be tackling that, which sounds like a really big topic, but we're going to try to take a little slice of the pie and hopefully give you some great nuggets. Ellen, anything that you want to share before we jump in?
Yeah, well, I'm just curious, Morgan, about your experience. I know you and I both grew up in faith-based homes with, we grew up in different cultures, religious cultures, but we both grew up loving God, knowing God, following the Bible. So I'm curious how temptation, especially sexual temptation, was how you viewed it early on growing up. Because I know the way it was kind of in our church culture growing up, it was the worst kind of temptation. And it was almost sinful even to have the temptation. That's where the sin felt like it started, is even if you desire this sin, you have already sinned in having a temptation. So was that similar to how you grew up? Was it different? How was that with you?
Great question. I actually have really fond memories of how I grew up in my church culture. It was a very grace-based approach. And I think the benefit of that was that you were allowed to let the grace of God just shower you. Like, I didn't feel a lot of shame, or
Mhm.
I didn't feel a lot of concern, which I'm going to get to this maybe a little bit later in our conversation, but it wasn't as big of a red flag for me of like,
Mhm.
oh, I have these sexual temptations, or I have these temptations that are coming up because God loves me, I'm forgiven, and like, it's okay, But I think what I realize now is because it didn't uh throw up a red flag for me when I was put in compromising positions. I didn't really have the, oh no, I probably shouldn't be feeling this or probably shouldn't be doing this, but rather
Mhm.
like, this is new and this is exciting and this is unfamiliar and unknown. And some people get scared of that and run away. My
Mhm.
personality, I was like, ooh,
Thrilled by it. Yeah.
let me dive into it, if that
Yeah.
makes sense. So yeah, I think I have some pretty fond memories of it. I don't think it was something that I necessarily like didn't sit down and say like, "Hey, mom, I'm having this temptation," but I definitely don't have like a negative memory of it.
Yeah.
Most of that as I got into like my teens, um, it then became like, "Oh, I now know I'm doing something I'm not supposed to be doing." And so I don't even want to venture into talking about the temptation because I've already, again, that curiosity, I already dove into it.
Right.
So there wasn't a lot of training, if that makes sense. What about
Yeah.
you?
Well, I think that's so great and so healthy. I mean, of course, it's easy to say that on the other side of it, where I grew up
Yeah.
with a lot of shame, and I think what I heard you say was there wasn't a lot of alarm. You think about that scripture, I think it's in 2 Corinthians 7, that talks about what repentance should look like. And one of the things
Mm-hmm.
is what alarm you have over what you've done. So it sounds like in the way that you grew up, the benefit was that stability in knowing that God loves you and that,
Mm-hmm.
whatever you do can't disrupt that. And I love that. I think that's so important. Sounds like what was lacking maybe was that alarm, like, hey, out of my love for God and my show of gratitude for his love, I need to have that alarm to make sure I'm staying within these boundaries and honor our, devotion to each other. But what I had was the opposite, which was a lot of shame induced, too much alarm, where my connection with God was kind of born out of this alarm. Right.
Mm,
And it's, you ever know that game you play with like a flower and you pull the petals and it's like, he loves me. He loves me
yeah.
not. Like, that's what my early relationship with God or knowledge of God felt like, was like, if
Yeah.
you're not struggling today, if you're not having any kind of major temptations, he loves you. And if you read your Bible for 15 minutes and prayed and did all these things, he loves you. And then as soon as you don't,
Yeah.
he loves you not. And so it was like this roller coaster of connection. And so that led to the good of that is that I was good at determining what are some boundaries I need to keep and what do I need to stay away from. The bad of that is that my devotion to God was coming out of fear and
Mm,
alarm instead of a genuine love, not just a genuine love for him, but also a security in knowing his love for me. So I look at your experience with longing, because what a difference that could have made. So that's kind of what I'm hoping to dispel for people who might have grown up in either situation, is how can we merge the two and be comforted in God's love even when we mess up, but how can we bolster it with some boundaries to honor our connection with him?
absolutely. And I think we can start, right? When I'm looking at this as a holistic picture, right? It's like, well, what does God say about temptation? And then what happens when we encounter temptation? And I
Mhm.
think sometimes, um, I don't know if this is your experience, but a lot of what I've heard is like, when you come in contact with temptation, and a little bit of what you were alluding to was bad alarm. You are tempted.
Right.
There must be something wrong with you. You've made a bad decision. You should not be tempted. What are your thoughts about that? Do you think that's true? Do you think that's in line with the what the Bible teaches for somebody who's coming into this and they might fall either on my side of the spectrum, your side of the spectrum, maybe they fall in the middle.
Mhm.
What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, how I see it is we were created for Eden. So we were created to live in a perfect state of connection. All of our needs for connection and identity and worth would be met perfectly by God, right? So we'd be perfectly connected to God, to self, to each other, and to creation. Then we are out of Eden now. And so we have these huge deficits in our hearts, in our identity, in our worth, in our love, in our connection with God, self, and others. And because of that deficit, we look to fill that void with things outside of God. Even as Christians, we do this, right? Like, even though we found God, we still don't experience him in that Edenic way that we were made to. So we still try to fill stuff in that void in our heart, that outside of God. So I think that's why we experience temptation, is because we all have this void. Even if we found God, we all have this, what's it called? Aching void in our hearts, where we long for Eden. We long for that perfect state of connection with God, self, and others. And because we don't have it, there are things that pop up in life that we think, maybe that novelty will fill this void and quell that ache in my heart. So I don't think it's crazy to say that we experience temptation. I don't think God is surprised by it. I don't think we should be surprised by it. We don't live in Eden. That's just a fact. We were made for Eden. So there's automatically this discrepancy. So I certainly don't think we need to be alarmed, like shocked by it. I don't think God is shocked by it. That's why he sent Jesus. He's definitely not surprised by it. But I do think out of our love for God, we're called to try to avoid temptation and try to deny temptation. But even when we give into it, I don't think God is surprised. I think what he's most concerned about is reconnecting with us, right? I think that's the worst part for him, is being disconnected from us. So if temptation or sin is taking us away from him, I think the worst thing we can do, which tends to be the very thing that we do in our shame, we remove ourselves even more from God. And he's like, hey, I'm not surprised by your sin. I know it's going to happen. That's why I sent my son to die for you. But just run back to me as soon as possible so that we don't have to endure this disconnection anymore.
Right. And the things that keep us from running back to God, right? Our shame, are the negativity or the negative feelings we have towards ourselves of like, oh, I can't bear to go back to the one that I just hurt. But taking a step back, really like high level, what I hear you saying is, because we're sinful, temptation is born out of sin, right?
Yeah.
Because we're broken, because we're sinful, which I think, right, we live in this society that aims for perfection. You need to have perfect skin. You can't age. You have to have this body, right? Like society sets so many perfect ideals for us that sin is like, oh, I don't want badness in my life. I mean, even let's take the movie Inside Out, right? Sadness. If you haven't seen it, it's a kid's movie, talks all about emotion. And in the first Inside Out, the role of happy, right? There's happy, there's sadness, there's disgust. And happy is just trying to make sadness happy. She's like, no, you can't feel sad. Sad is bad, right? Like all these negative things, I think we just try to like stay as far away from them. And so I think the understanding, and something that's really helped me, is understanding that like temptation will come from my brokenness. It will come from sin because of what you're saying, right? Like I have these holes in my heart that some I know are there, right? We'll get to same-sex attraction in just a little bit, but there are other holes in my heart that I know they're there, and there are some that I am not aware of yet.
Yeah.
And so then all of a sudden, those are the temptations that I feel like come out of nowhere, and you're like, whoa, I've never had to deal with this temptation before. And then we start understanding, oh, there's a void here that's trying to get filled, right? And there's that self-awareness that needs to happen. So if we're starting big picture, right? And if you are somebody who's coming into it like, oh, temptation is bad, right? Like that's maybe a reshifting of our mindset of actually temptation is something that we are going to come in contact with because we are sinful. And there's really, until Jesus comes back, there's not going to be a cure to that, no matter how righteous of a Christian you may be or may think you may be. We're all sinful. So I think coming in with that framework, we can then approach like, okay, temptation as the actual act of temptation. How do we step into that? Was there anything else you wanted to add on that point?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what you're saying is making me think, what even is sin? I think I grew up thinking sin is some innate evil that lives in all of us that will rear its ugly head that we have to beat out of ourselves or out of our children, and before they become adults. And I think sin is just not God's way. Like, it's not so scary when we look at it that way. Like, we have God's way, and then That's what we longed for when we were in Eden. Now we're not in Eden. And so everything got twisted upside down. And sin is anything outside of what God deemed as our manufacturer, if you will, what God deemed, appropriate as our manufacturer's instructions. And so, of course, we long when we got thrust out of Eden, right? Like everything got topsy-turvy, and we longed for things that don't make sense according to God's way. But if we look at it that way, isn't temptation just a longing for that restored connection in Eden? Like at the base of it, isn't that what it is? And we have our broken, fallen ideas of what will quell that void, right? Drugs, alcohol, certain relationships, et cetera, food, et cetera, et cetera. But if we had a restored perspective, I think that the true longing would really actually be in line with how God created us. So I think what I love to offer people in any temptation is, hey, your temptations don't have to be scary. So what I see a lot with my clients, and especially in this realm of same-sex attraction, especially if they grew up similar to how I did with this incredible shame around sexual sin, then as soon as they feel the temptation, they're already, like their brain is already going off with shame, and they're already moving down that thought pattern of I'm terrible, I'm inherently evil, God doesn't love me anymore. I have, all of this is fueled by panic and alarm that I'm disconnected from God and I'm bad and I need to be good. I need to be back in his good graces. If instead we could step more to maybe God's perspective and say, it makes sense that I'm being tempted with this right now because I long for a type of connection that I just can't experience this side of heaven. And therefore, there's always this ache in my heart to be seen, to be known, to be wanted, to be adored, to be chased, right? And because of that, that leads me to feel tempted in these certain areas. That makes sense. I'm not afraid of it. In fact, I want to embrace it and find out what's at the root of that desire. It's what I find, like for me at least, right? When I feel extra tempted with attraction toward another woman, and if I'm not afraid of it and I can lean into it, usually what's at the root of it is I want to be seen. I want to be known. I want to be adored. I want to be chased. I want to feel wanted, right? Those are all good. Like there's nothing wrong with any of that. In fact, God created us to feel all of those things. He created us to get those needs met through him, but it's not bad to want to feel all of those things. We just have to navigate where we land those desires a little bit better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love how we've kind of shifted now into when we come into contact with temptation, what I hear you saying is, right, like we don't want to be afraid, right? If anything, we more so want to be like, oh, this makes sense. I would be tempted in this situation. And I think in light of this, it's really interesting to me how you can start to set up guardrails in your life to better anticipate those temptations. So, right, we made the connection that okay, we're sinful, inherently sinful, so we will encounter temptation. When we encounter that temptation, we shouldn't be shocked and we shouldn't be afraid because, right, there's that underlying root that is bringing that temptation to the surface. So now, how do we better interact with temptation, right? When you make it more like an object, it becomes less scary. It's doesn't have high emotion. It doesn't have a lot of shame. It doesn't have a lot of guilt. So after listening to you talk, I'm like, okay, so now I know when I'm married, right? So when I'm not feeling loved and seen and heard from my spouse, I will want to find that connection somewhere else. Because I've been in previous relationship with women, I know that my closest female relationships will be where I'll start to want to find that connection. Yeah. Therefore, will be led into these tempting situations. And so how do I limit that? Okay, first is the self-awareness, right? Is being able to stop and say, what am I feeling? If I'm looking for that attention from somebody else, it must be because that desire is telling me that I'm not getting it from a source that I should be, right? Which the example I just gave would be, oh, my spouse isn't giving that to me. Okay, well, my spouse can't meet all of my needs. Those needs need to come from God, which is interesting because I feel like every podcast we've done, Ellen, everything comes back to being completely whole and filled by God, and therefore our relationships will be healthy. But again, we're broken. They're not always that way. But I do think that it allows it to be, helps me be so much more prepared in my relationships with other people, because then I can stop myself before I go searching for that connection. I can say, okay, how is it upwards and how is it with my spouse? Am I being filled in those ways? Is there anything you would elaborate on that, or anything that sparks from that?
Yeah, I would say the missing ingredient, like I love what you just said, like, hey, it should be God filling up our cup completely. And then anything we're able to get from our spouses, our friends, etc., helps to overflow. But you're right, we don't live in Eden anymore. And so even though we have a personal relationship with God, he can't just this side of heaven, because we're broken, not because of a lack of power on his part, but because we're broken. He can't fill that void perfectly the way that we were created to. And so I think the missing ingredient in navigating that is just this existential grief that will always exist, right? Like there is always this parallel grief, even to the joys of life. Even when, like, I just had this moment recently, a few weeks ago, when my husband and I were talking about something, and I felt like it was something nobody was really understanding in my life. And I was talking to my husband about it, and he got it more than anyone, but he still didn't fully understand. And I had this, like, I was talking to my husband, but privately, this moment with God alongside that, and thought, whom have I in heaven but you? Like, nobody gets me except for you, even my husband, who got it more than anyone. And so even with this connection I felt with my husband, there was this grief that even he doesn't fully understand me, and he can't. And even though I have a personal relationship with God, there is still a void because I don't walk with him in the cool of the day in the garden. I don't live in Eden. And so I don't think we can do any of this without learning to grieve well. I'll just put that plug in there.
Yeah.
But as we're navigating temptation practically, I would say, yes, start with, like we said, don't be afraid of it. Even be compassionately embracing of it. I love how you said it. Like, how does this make sense? That's my job as a therapist. There's an old adage, all behavior makes sense in context. It's my job as a therapist to find that context. And it's your job as a Christian, I would say, to find that context internally. Like you used Inside Out as an example. There's a type of therapy called internal family systems, IFS, and it's actually like really well described through the movie Inside Out. And we talk about parts of self, right? And so that's how I would refer. Okay, if there's a temptation that you're experiencing, turn to that part of you and say, how does this make sense? I'm your little therapist. How does this make sense that you would feel tempted in this way? Just like you were, kind of moving us through a minute ago. And then compassionately get curious about it. What is the underlying desire here? And then how is that desire met in God? And where's the grief that we just need to feel, long term, that we just don't live in Eden? And how can we be comforted by God in that grief?
Yeah. The older I get, the more I realize that grief is a companion in life. And the sooner you can embrace that, I think the sooner we can deepen our relationship with God. Because I think grief is something that it's not pleasant to feel. And I know that this isn't a podcast on grief, it's a podcast on temptation, but I think those two go hand in hand, because temptation, again, is born out of things that we feel like we're missing. And the more we try to fill up the things that we think are missing, the more grief is going to come from that, because we're filling a cup that has holes. And, I was just listening to this incredible book called Margin. You should read it if you haven't read it. Plug on that. But he was talking about how this hierarchy of systems were like, okay, we need to love God first, then we need to love our spouse, then we need to love our children, then we need to love our friends, right? It's like you must do one at a time. Instead, thinking of it as like an ecosystem. If God is in the middle, then we can essentially like build out from that, and that we really are a holistic person. And we have all of these things that we're interacting with. And I think the reason I'm thinking of that in context to this is like, there is going to be grief in every one of those buckets in my life, even my relationship with God. I know that even starting off the new year, right? It's January 7th. And I'm like, oh, I just want to wake up and meet God every morning and have solitude and silence And
Yeah.
January 1st happens and my plan is ruined
Yeah.
by a number of reasons. And then I feel grief, right? Of like,
Yeah.
oh, I really wanted this with God and now I don't have it. And right then the temptation is to just fall off and be like, oh, well,
Mm.
it didn't work. But rather like what I hear you saying and what I'm taking away is, okay, when these temptations arise, whether it's same-sex attraction, relationally, what I thought my relationship with God in the new year was going to look like, rather be like, okay, temptation, I see you, I hear you, I'm not afraid of you, but like, where are you coming from and what am I desiring? I really am desiring to be close to you, God. And I'm sad and I'm grieving that it didn't look exactly how I thought it looked, but help me take the next step forward and meet you again. Help me set a good boundary to not encounter this temptation. Open my eyes to see like what I'm really feeling so that we can continue to take steps towards reconciliation and redemption with God, right? Instead of
Yeah.
continuing down the brokenness path, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so a good visual, I'm thinking, because I want to like make this tangible for people. So uh, if you were lost at sea and you were really thirsty, um, you might drink the seawater and get more and more thirsty, right? Like you would get more and more sick. So I think like what we end up doing in our temptation, at least what I've seen in like my church culture, is we're lost at sea and we look at that seawater and we're like, I know I shouldn't drink it, but I'm so thirsty. And then that's where we stop and we're like, I'm such a terrible person. I'm such a sinner. I can't believe I want this seawater, right? If instead we were able to say, it makes sense, I want that seawater because I'm thirsty and it looks like water that will, sustain me right now when I'm really thirsty. But I know that because of the concentration of that water, it's actually going to be worse for me. That's not how God created me to drink seawater. So here's what I have to do. I need to row to shore so that I can get some fresh water to meet my need, my legitimate, genuine, good need for water, right? So if we could shift the way that we handle temptation to something like that, there's still grief. I'm still lost at sea. I still don't have a glass of fresh water right next to me. Like it's still sad, but all is not lost. I don't need to gulp the seawater and just die right here, right now, because I'm so terrible of a person that I would want seawater, right? So I think like when I hear a lot of, I think especially this is true for what I see, single women who are Christians and attracted to the same sex, they feel so down on themselves when they feel this temptation to even be held, to be physically loved by another human. And when we kind of break it down, we're like, actually, it makes sense that you have that desire. God created you to desire physical touch. Like that's a need that we have. If we don't have that when we're little, we will literally die. So that's a need that God created you to have. That's a good desire. It's not being met right now in the way that you had always envisioned or the way that you wanted in a spouse. That's really sad. Or with a woman. And that's really sad. That's something to grieve and to mourn.
Yeah.
But all is not lost. You have avenues that you can pursue that are within God's realm where you can get that need met, maybe not fully, but at least you can take the edge off of that need, that legitimate need in a legitimate way, instead of meeting that legitimate need with an illegitimate source. So, you have friends at church, you can go get a big hug from them. You have, a family you've been kind of adopted into, and you can go spend some special one-on-one time with them, right? So I think like there is that grief because it's not met in the way that we want. We're not in Eden. But then there's all hope is not lost. There are still legitimate ways we can get those needs met, at least in some way, that is still within God's realm for us.
Absolutely. Thanks for that visual that we can end on, Ellen. I think it's always helpful when we can take a concept. Again, we talked about this concept of a mountain. We're taking a little piece of the pie, being able to take it into tangible terms and then be able to have a visual that we can remember from it. So thank you for joining us today. We hope that you have found something helpful when you encounter temptation in this upcoming week, that you are not afraid of the temptation, but that you can lean into it and really let God lead you through it. We'll see you next time.